Welcome. I'm David Jacobs at American University. The topic is faculty status, precarity, and unionism, authoritarianism in Florida. We're here in Seattle. Some of us are. Welcome to Seattle. This is an illustration by the cartoonist Herbert Bloch. In the 1950s, he was worried about McCarthyism. He suggested in this cartoon that those who were hysterical about communism were in fact seeking to exterminate, to extinguish the flame of freedom. And I'm worried about authoritarianism as it's emerged in the US context through a set of policies and actions by a variety of lobbies who have enormous power. One factor in all the states where conservative authoritarianism has become dominant is the role of the evangelicals. The evangelical churches, in many cases, have become aligned with corporate interests and are harking back to the churches that were aligned with slavery in the pre-Civil War era. Another important organization is the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is in effect a parallel state legislature. It consists of legislators and lobbyists who meet together and come to agreement on legislation to pursue, and they pursue this across the states in a cookie cutter format. The ALEC, or ALEC, is responsible in part for the stand your ground legislation in Florida, which allowed concerned individuals to shoot first when they felt threatened by African Americans in particular. Also anti-environmental policy, efforts to restrain the power of labor, to limit increase the minimum wage, were all part of this ALEC campaign. Incidentally, ALEC is part of the Council for National Policy, which is the coordination vehicle for the right and played a role in the Stop the Steal movement and in supporting the insurrectionists to some degree. Now, in order to make sense of the variance across the states in the US, we should look at this diagram created by a California activist who was quite impressed by the degree to which states varied in their COVID policies. The Western states packed, the Midwestern and Northeastern states packed, the efforts by individual cities to fight the policies of their state governments. In effect, conservative interests, when dominant in a particular state, sought to limit the damage for business and limit public health protection. And then in those very same states, minority cities would seek to increase public health protection. The map of COVID policy networks reveals an extraordinary degree of policy variance, and these networks of blue and red states, which in effect were forming alternative associations to lobby for their positions. The absence of a nationally guaranteed right to vote permits considerable anti-democratic mischief on the state level, influencing the priorities on public health and enterprise profits. States with Republican control across the legislature and executive branch tended toward more relaxed COVID policies and now seek to impose conservative policies on state higher education. ALEC and the other conservative interests are not very happy with the very notion of public education, and they seek to restrict autonomy of faculty, among other factors. The background fact about voting rights is that the Supreme Court has cut the heart out of the US Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. With the important provision removed, states can initiate changes in voting without the necessary pre-clearance that applied in southern states, other states where there was a history of discrimination. It illustrates conservative leaders have reintroduced levels of voter suppression not seen since before the modern civil rights era. In Florida, there's an important issue there in that immigrants and young voters, others, unions, can in fact issue progressive policy, but the rural interests and conservative interests are seeking to prevent that possibility and cement red policy governance. Weakening the university is one of the projects of these conservative interests. It's interesting that in the 1970s, when my father was a leader of the faculty union, he would argue with people about tenure. They would say, why are universities protected in this sense? he would make the point that at that moment, employees in other sorts of organizations had a measure of employment security, and that university faculty had a longer period of time to establish their probationary status. So the concept of job security is not new. The tradition of job security in the university has some connection to the old origins of the university and the notion of the guild in the context of higher education. But that is kind of anathema to the conservative interests who want to increase precarity, insecurity among employees of all kinds. Now, the Florida legislature is considering measures that would essentially abolish tenure, ban instruction on gender and so-called critical race studies, and require a conservative conception of viewpoint diversity. In this context, as in many others, faculty autonomy is threatening to authoritarian systems. Professors at the University of Florida actually have been prohibited by the state hierarchy to participate in the lawsuit to overturn voter restriction legislation. As I mentioned, ALEC pushes for the limitation of the right to vote, making it more difficult for people to vote through voter ID and limitation of voting polling places. This is in order to cement red state authoritarianism. A federal judge ordered the university to stop enforcing this policy. So there's been some pushback, but the controversy continues. According to an article in the Orlando Sentinel, in his efforts to remake higher education in Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis has sought to alter the tenure system, remove Florida universities from commonly used accreditation practices, and as I mentioned, mandate annual diversity surveys. Also, the Stop Woke Act would regulate so-called critical race studies. If there's no discussion of critical race studies, then perhaps governments can limit the right to vote with impunity. Now, we have the American Association of University Professors, which has recently joined the American Federation of Teachers, pointing out the purpose underlying this sort of legislation from Florida. The idea is that higher education faculty are the enemy and must be subjugated. This is, in fact, a very authoritarian agenda which seeks to limit pluralism in the state of Florida. All sorts of measures which would limit the protections of tenured faculty and limit what they can say in the classroom. Now, how do faculty fight back? It is good that the American Association of University Professors, which is a professional association that's become more like a union, has joined the American Federation of Teachers. If these organizations, AUP, other faculty unions, SEIU in some jurisdictions, are able to build coalitions with minority groups and others, focusing on the right to vote and clarity as to lobbying, and if they are able to restore a measure of democracy, this really is a battle about democracy with implications for higher education. So if there's coalescence and a high level of participation, in effect, it requires an upheaval among lower status groups, then perhaps Florida can be brought back in the more pluralistic blue realm. Thank you very much. See you in Seattle.